All right, everyone. I have on Amelia Kriss today, and she is a therapist and coach. And she introduced a new aspect to me that I had never heard of called birth story medicine. And I'm going to have her explain exactly what it is because I could read you all the cool things that she sent, but she's the one who's an expert in this. And we're going to dive into preparing for giving birth with her as well, and kind of what led her into wanting to share and wanting to talk about this with us. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad to have you here. And just for the listeners, I was like a super hot mess today. So I'm really grateful for Amelia being patient with me while I was figuring my life out. So
Absolutely. I mean, I think patience and grace, speaking of like pregnancy, birth, postpartum, like there's never enough. We can't overdo it. So it's all good.
yes, yes. So yeah, how
Um,
did you get into all of this?
yeah. So yes, I will tell you. So I'm a drama therapist, which means that I use like acting and theater techniques therapeutically. And that's my training is like the counseling psychology stuff as you sort of traditionally understand it. And then also these sort of creative arts techniques that hopefully can help us embody things and maybe explore things that aren't necessarily that intellectual or that verbal. And many of our emotional experiences can be like that. So that's sort of the beginning of my journey. And then I'm also a certified coach, and that work came mostly out of wanting to be able to support people in like maybe a more practical way. I think therapy is amazing, and there are lots of therapists who practice in a very solution focused, practical way. But I also wanted that toolbox, I'll say. So birth story medicine is like the latest thing for me, and that's kind of how my work and how my life is like the more experience I gather from my own life and from working with people, it then sort of shifts what I'm interested in and what I'm even aware of, which is sort of how birth story medicine started. So birth story medicine, just like quickly, is I did not come up with it. It's a methodology that was developed by Pam England, who's an incredible midwife. So she's been one of my mentors in that work. And then I also have another teacher, Denise Sir Almag, who's also mentored me. And I think the essence of it is about how the way we tell ourselves stories about what happened, not just the birth experience itself, but the way we interpret that and what we think it means about us. That's where often a lot of the struggle and also a lot of the healing can happen for
Mhm.
people. Um, and so it's a really focused, like usually a one session situation with people where we really dive into telling, exploring their birth story in a different way. Like, I think you're a doula, right? You have a
Yeah.
doula background. Yeah. So you know, right? Like you've witnessed many births, I'm sure, and you've probably told and heard many birth stories. And often the story we tell socially, if you will, is often a very medical version. It's like, this happened, then I went to the hospital. If that's where you went, then this happened. And like, how dilated was I and what intervention and all of that.
Mhm.
And that is a version of the story.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. But I think often where people get caught up when we think about like birth trauma or even just having unresolved or recurring thoughts about the birth that feel kind of nagging for folks, often that's about what meaning did I assign to that moment, right? Telling myself the story like, oh, well, if I hadn't said yes to that intervention, or if I had just earlier done this, then such and such wouldn't have happened. And the fact that it did means that I'm whatever, often these are not very conscious, but it's like, I'm weak, or I failed,
Mhm.
or,
I
this
gave
was
up.
I gave up, right?
Mhm.
This was my first big, right? Act as a parent and I didn't do it right, like quote unquote, right? And I'm not saying that stuff is necessarily super conscious for people, but I think unconsciously it drives a lot of the way that we feel. Um, and so long story short, birth story medicine is a way for people to put some space, hopefully, between what happened, right? We don't get a do-over on that. Sometimes we have subsequent births, but there's no doing that one again.
Right.
But we do get to look at what are the stories we're telling ourselves? What are we saying that means? Because those conclusions that we draw about ourselves or about other people, right? Often there's a lot of anger about providers or how our partner showed up or didn't show up. And all those feelings are totally valid. And often they're connected to stories that aren't true, or at least aren't complete, and at some point aren't useful. And that's the work that we're doing, is sort of starting to kind of untangle some of that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, as you were describing it, that's such an amazing idea. Um, and I think it's something that's so needed, because most people that I talk to, even if everything went the way that you had envisioned, birth is a crazy experience,
Oh my
no matter
gosh.
how you birth. And things come up in that moment. Like, everything that you could have planned for could have happened. It could have been your dream experience, but also you just brought a life into this world. And
Absolutely.
emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever it may be, there still could be things there to work
Yes.
through.
I mean,
Even
mhm,
processing the good sometimes. Like,
totally.
or even downplaying it. Like, let's say everything, you're like, yeah, but what? And it's like, no, you just had a baby.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is so important. And thank you, because I think I want to speak a little bit also to the fact that birth is, as you're saying, it's an immense, profound, transformative experience. No matter how it goes, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
have to go badly. We don't have to feel sad or angry. I mean, usually it's mixed. We feel a lot of things, right? But that it can be, beautiful, and we can experience it that way. More importantly, the story we tell ourselves about it might be that it was beautiful. And still, there's so little, to your point, education or contextualizing that this is a huge transformative experience. If you feel changed by it, if you have questions you don't know the answer to, if you have a hard time finding your way back to the person you felt like before,
Mm.
that's so normal, right? And I think that's a missing piece of the conversation when I think about, and this ties into the work that I'm now developing with pregnant folks, right? Like, love birth story medicine. And it brought up the question for me, is there some preventative medicine here? What could I do ahead of the experience with people that would help them feel grounded in the fact that this is a threshold that you don't come back from unchanged?
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with the choices you made, or maybe even what happened. Sometimes there is, but like, that is the experience, that is the nature of it. And so rather than making it be like, what happened to me and why am I still so stuck in that? And why do I keep telling that story? Or why can I not even think about it? Or whatever that is, some of that is because there's clinically significant things that we need to do, right? Like, I personally, I don't work with really significant postpartum stuff in terms of like depression or anxiety or OCD. There's specialists for that. My work is around like the stories.
Mhm.
But often for those of us who are really very much okay in terms of what we would think of as like not in crisis,
Mhm.
we still are experiencing, as you said, on every level, one of the most profound and in some ways quick, even though we have the whole pregnancy,
Right. Like, in a
identity
moment.
shifts available to human
Right.
beings, right?
Mhm.
And to spend all this time as childbirth educators, and that's not my field, and I have mad respect on what labor might look like, right? Without saying to people, it's not just about understanding this process, because it's not just a physiological process. It's also about who you are, right?
Mhm.
And that's where the preparation work that I'm really focused on with pregnant people lives is, yeah, you might not be an OB. Yeah, you might not have had a baby before. You might not be a doula, but you know yourself, right? How do we dig into like, what is comforting to you? How do you cope when things are stressful or uncertain or they take a long time, right? What is a smart support system for who you know yourself to be?
Mhm.
Because we don't get to control how the birth goes, right? Like, the whole idea of a birth plan, I think, question mark. Maybe it's just the language needs to be different, because so many people come to me and they feel like that was somehow some set of expectations they did or did not meet, about like, well, I didn't do that, so that didn't work. And it's like, we can't plan this. What we
Mhm.
can plan, or what we can prepare for, I should say, is how we want to show up. And so that, I think, is what it's about. It's like, know thyself, and then from there, with yourself, with your partner, with your support people, providers. Really talk honestly with yourself first, but with everyone about like, this is the kind of touch that I like. I really like music. I'm not really into candles, right? Or like, I'm an affirmation meditations person. Like, y'all got to be quiet, or like, y'all got to leave, or like, whatever it is. We get to bring that knowledge to this. Like, where have you struggled, and what are your strengths, and where do you get stuck? And I think that is the planning and the preparation, alongside the context that this is a huge rite of passage. That I think is actually more realistic and grounding for people than make a big long list of what you don't want and what you do want. And then in each moment of the process as it unfolds, either congratulate or blame yourself for not having that.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely see that. I like that you said that, just kind of like talking about the control aspect. Because so as a birth doula, I'm a huge fan of birth plans, but what I always tell people, I call it a birth wish, because plans can be
It's a better
changed.
word.
Yeah. And there's so many things that can be out of your control, but my hope in doing one, that's why, like, I just don't like the blind, like checking yes and no.
Yeah.
To me, it's about being educated and informed so that you feel empowered along the process, and know that, like, just kind of understanding what's happening, and knowing like, okay, if this happens, this might be happen, or there might be other alternatives or whatever, just like having some of that empowerment and education. I think that that's big. And I know from like my first birth, I had this birth plan, this big birth wish, and it did not go as planned at all. And a lot of the things were completely out of my control. I could not control the fact that my daughter inhaled meconium into her lungs and ended up in the NICU. Like, I could not control that she was sunny side up and cockeyed trying to come out of my birth canal. And I literally thought my legs were being ripped off of my body. Like, it was the worst ever. And I did not want to get an epidural, but I ended up getting one with her. And because I was educated on the process, I knew that that was a tool in the moment that I needed. And it let my body completely relax. It let her finish coming down the birth canal. And I birthed her like 2 hours after I got the epidural.
Yeah.
When I had been in labor for like 20 hours. So like, that was like the tool that I needed in the moment. But I did tell myself, I did have a narrative, right? I had, even though I knew, like, and then after my second birth experience went completely different, and it was amazing and glorious, but that actually gave me closure with my first birth, because because my daughter was in the perfect position the second time. She was facing the right way. She was engaged in the birth canal. My contractions were, even though I ended up not getting an epidural the second time, the first time was much more painful, more painful, because of her positioning and where everything was. And after I gave birth to my second daughter, I was like, whoa, like, I really did need that epidural, and I'm okay now with the choice that I made.
Yes.
So it was like a healing experience, but there's still, I love everything that you're talking about, because there are so many stories that we tell ourselves, like with all of this. And I think it's so important to talk about that. And the like losing yourself in motherhood, like your identity shifts in a moment. Like, that's huge.
Absolutely.
And that we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that.
It's huge. I mean, I'm obsessed with Alexander Sachs, who's this reproductive psychologist.
Yeah, she came on here.
Okay. So her work on matrescence, and like that framing of like, you are moving through hormonally, physiologically, emotionally, one of the biggest leaps, right? We talk about leaps a lot with our babies and kids, but us, right? Available to human beings. And then we spend a lot of that time being like, I'm not really doing it right, and feeling guilty and ashamed. And it's like, you are doing you are like, whoa, please reframe that, you know? So I think, I love what you're saying too. And I think the stories and the birth plan, or the birth wish, whatever we call it, connect, right? So in my personal experience with my first daughter, I didn't know this at the time, because you don't know what you don't know, but I had this very strong story about what an empowered, woke, feminist birth was. And I was like, I'm going to do that. Right. That's what I want. And it didn't go that way. And I didn't know, right? Like that story is what wrote my birth plan, not me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And noticing like that birth plan that story wrote is never going to be useful to me because I didn't write it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what the awareness piece is about. And that's the first work that I'm sort of, as I'm building this program for pregnant folks, that the first piece of it I'm imagining is like, what are your sort of family stories about birth, your cultural stories,
huge.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, if you're a doula or you're in the birth world, what has your perspective been in that, right? What meaning have you made out of what you've witnessed
Mm-hmm.
in other people's experiences? Because as we start to uncover that, then we can go, okay, what if this is useful? What if this is even mine?
Right. That's huge.
And then making a birth wish, thinking about it. It's like, what I want is to be able to help folks land in the reality of who they are rather than trying to project into the uncertainty of what the birth is or should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just feel like I just need to do some snaps because like everything that you're saying, like I loved how you talked about like before you even give birth, how do you cope? How do you
Exactly.
cope when things are like all these things are so good? 'Cause that's all of this is like a big missing piece like that we're not talking about. And so I love that you're on here talking about this because it's like, how do you normally handle stress? How do you respond to these different situations? And also that communication between your partner, you have to be able to tell them, hey, do not touch me right now and shut up. Like
Right.
when you're in birth, and you have
Yeah.
to be able to stand up for yourself and open that communication and be like, hey, honey, like I love you. Normally, I love it when you play with my hair, whatever. I don't know how I'm going to feel in birth. So if I scream at you, that's fine. It's
Absolutely.
my
And I
process and it has nothing to do with you.
absolutely. And I think that context is huge for partners too, right? Like that, and that can be a beautiful element beforehand of practicing, whether it's your partner, whoever your support person's going to be, a doula. I want to just say, get a doula. If
Yeah.
you can't or don't, get someone. Like none of us
Or take a
should.
course, something to
Right.
educate
We don't
yourself.
we don't need to be alone in this. I think
Mhm.
that's another part of the stories, right? And it continues in motherhood and parenthood too, this idea that somehow we should have it together or we should do it all. No, not possible. Let's wake up from that delusion collectively and start living in the real world where this is hard and beautiful, and none of us were meant to do it alone.
Yeah.
So I feel really strongly about that.
Mhm.
But also that you get to practice, right, with your support people ahead of time, like what kind of touch do you like? And also with the caveat, I don't know what I'm going to like then, right? And I need permission to tell you and to need it and to not caretake how you feel about that need. Like in the same way, I think that's another piece of grounding it as such a profound experience is like, this is not the same thing, but imagine that I was like in a boxing ring and my partner was like in my corner, right? Like feeding me water and taking care of me. I hope in that moment that all of our partners would be like, I'm not going to take this personally. You're just like having a really intense experience, right? And I think that framing is really important for us and for our support people. Like we're going to be, right? We're going to go back to older parts of our brain at some point in this process. You're going to see some animal parts of me come forward. I'm going to see that. Also, in the same vein as how do you cope? What do you know about how you respond when something comes forward in you that surprises you? What do you know about what it's like to be at the edge of yourself? We know these things about ourselves if we spend some time reflecting, right? And that is, I think of the birth whole, all the education and the process as like kind of roughly like knowledge and wisdom. And I think all the science and physiology and stuff like that knowledge is big. And I think it's part of what makes people feel grounded enough to then tap into the wisdom, right? It's like when people say about like, sometimes people talk about like performers or like famous singers or dancers, and it'll be like, do your homework, like know it cold, and then get out there and forget it. Because the experiencing it, the doing it is different than studying it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the magic here. But if all we have is the like knowledge and none of kind of the self-awareness and wisdom, we're really missing a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think we also are setting ourselves up in a lot of cases for a lot of suffering and pain that is like not necessary and avoidable in large part.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that wisdom piece is a big thing that's just kind of missing from society in general.
Right.
Like creating room to tap into that because we're so busy, we're so
Yeah.
distracted. We'll do anything besides spending 5 minutes alone with our thoughts. Like anything, like
Mhm.
mindlessly do something
Yeah.
um, before we would sit alone with our own thoughts. So I love that you're talking about that because I mean, what better time to start to do that before you're going to have a baby and going back to the identity thing, I think that that's just so key because there's so many things that people will say, nobody warned me about
Nobody
this.
told me. Why didn't
Right.
anybody tell me?
Right. But it's hard to tell because there's a lot of things that people don't talk about. And then there's a lot of things that everybody's experience is different, but the
Totally.
experience is the same of shifting that identity.
Right.
And that is something that we don't prepare for. I feel like that's everyone's like, oh, you're gonna have a baby. It like, oh, it's so amazing. Oh,
Yeah.
like they just almost project these things onto you,
Right.
and then everything becomes about the baby. You have a baby, and it's how's the
Yeah.
baby? How's the baby? How's the baby? How's the baby sleeping? How's the baby eating? How's the baby? Da, 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 da,
Mhm.
da. And there are a few people maybe that are checking in on you here and there, and that kind of fades out. But that identity doesn't change from I'm learning how to feed my baby. Like I'm learning how to take care of my postpartum body. And then even a year from now, it's like, okay, now my kid is doing this, this, this. Like my parental role is continually evolving and
Of
shifting.
course.
Right. And that is such like, I'm no longer the same. And you just talk so much about, you hear people talking about how they've lost themselves. Like,
Mhm.
I feel like I lost myself in motherhood. Like, I feel like I don't
Mhm.
know who I am, but it's like, but you are not the same person. So can we shift the conversation? Let's figure out who you are now. Like,
Yeah.
what do you look like in this role now? Because I'm never going to be the 26-year-old person who was doing crazy things ever again.
Right.
Like my single pre-baby life is extremely different than my
Of
post-baby
course.
life. And my likes and things have changed. So it's hard for me when people are like, used to be so fun and exciting. And I'm like, honestly, when I have downtime, I want to nap and sit on my couch. So
Right.
like I'm not as social anymore because
Yeah.
I don't want to be, honestly.
Totally. And I think that's really big what you're saying, which is that some of it is about like life circumstances and growth and development and seasons of our lives, but some of it is also about our capacity, right? Like I can imagine that your 26-year-old self like had a lot of energy to go
Yeah.
do all that stuff. And now you're allocating that energy for something else, right? And maybe if you had endless energy, right, there would be room for, like sometimes it's about want and sometimes it's about can, and sometimes it's in the middle. But I think it's also, as you're saying, right, that not only do we have this sort of sanitized or sort of silver lined version of motherhood, and I think we do this in a lot of ways to women and to people of all genders, where it's like we're gonna like say the nice thing, we're gonna like
Mhm.
keep it light, like we're gonna good vibes only, right? Like good vibes only is not always good vibes. Like
Well, no, no.
like the truth is that like our experiences are mixed, and
Mhm.
as you're saying, I think it's not as black and white as like, I was this person and now I'm this brand new person, right? There's an element of that, but it's also like what from before or what that maybe has gone dormant in you in your pregnant or motherhood life wants to come alive again. And can you make room for that? And also what's new? And is that okay? Right? Rather than like, I was her and now I'm her. Right. And that like this polarization, I think happens across all of it. Like in the same way, like I think a lot about the messages and stories around birth in our right
Mhm.
society. And that it's like if you think about it, it's very black and white, it's very polarized. It's either like birth is this like medically necessary crisis, right? That must be managed. And like you're in danger and so is your baby. And like, and then the other side, if I characterize the sort of like natural birth movement, although I want to say that all birth is natural,
Yeah.
but y'all know what I'm talking about,
I
is
I
that
like to call it unmedicated.
unmedicated is a better word, right? So then if I characterize like the really far end of that, then there's sometimes this messaging, even if it's not explicit, that's like, if we're strong enough or pure enough or enlightened enough, we get to have this like blissful, even orgasmic experience, right? And I'm not saying that either side of those spectrums, those extremes aren't true for some people, but I think for most of us, it's mixed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the same way that we're mixed, I'm the person I was before and I'm not, and I'm someone new and I'm not, right? Like it's messy because humans are messy and our identities are messy. And I think that's part of where all the sort of shame and perfectionism and stuff that I see get really loud in postpartum time. A lot of it, I think, is because we don't have a lot of models for, or a lot of tolerance for, the messy, like mixed bag middle of it all. Like it's a very gray area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need permission for that. And the more permission we give ourselves for it to be all the things, the more enjoyable the good parts get to be, because we're actually there for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Everything you're saying, I feel like really resonates with some internal stuff I've been going through lately, just with balancing between feeling like this is really freaking hard.
Oh,
And this is like the best thing I've ever done in my life.
absolutely.
And finding that, like, not getting into like the mommy martyrdom
Totally.
ish of, because I feel like that's the messaging I've been seeing so much, is like, man, life's just hard. It just sucks. Of course, it's another thing, of
Right.
course your kid shit on the floor today. Why wouldn't they?
Right.
And you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, that did happen, like, and so it's just like, oh, another thing, versus like, man, this is like what I always wanted to be a mom.
Same.
Like, I've always been like a nurturing person. I've wanted to be a mom. I didn't know if it would ever happen because just you go through life and you're waiting to find the right person,
Yeah.
or maybe you're doing things differently. You're just waiting for circumstances to align. And I'm like, I found my person, and I've never tried to be pregnant before. I had never been pregnant before. So I'm like, I don't even know if I can get pregnant. Like,
Totally.
so, and then everything happens and it's hard. And,
Oh yeah.
and I was talking to somebody recently who, she was saying, she had struggled with infertility, and now she has a 14-month-old. And she's like, we tried for years for this baby and they ended up doing IVF. And she's like, I feel like I don't have the right to like ever complain that anything's hard, because we hoped and we prayed and we tried and we did, everything. And now it's like, man, the season I am in right now kind of sucks. Like, it's a little bit hard, but I don't have the right to say that. Like,
I've heard that too, particularly from parents who've had fertility struggles. But I think it's something that I think we all can resonate with, right? Like this. And I think even if there's no fertility struggles, right? Often, our society like kind of reveres motherhood or parenthood or families as a concept, but there's very little practical support, right? Like if we meant that, we would have paid parental leave, right? Like there's a disconnect between what we sort of pedestalize and what we actually practice, right? And I think that's another thing about what you're saying, which is like, I don't have a right to, right? That it can't be both. It can't be, I love my children breathlessly, and we all do. And there are things about this role that really chafe for me. Both of those things, right? And that the more we can accept, right, the whole narrative, right? And as you're saying, right, neither side, right? It's all the good vibes only side and the complete cynicism, like, of course, right? Another day, like more BS, right? That neither of those makes room for our actual experience most of the time. And that is, I think, the thing that not just our kids need, but that we all need, is space to have our mixed, messy, gorgeous, not so good, very crappy experiences. Because part of, I think, what makes the hard is the idea or the isolation, right? The shame story that this is hard because I'm not good enough. Or if I were a better mom, or if I'd only done this or that, or like this person I saw on Instagram, she has it all together. It's like, you don't know her life.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you're not putting this internal struggle you're having on the gram, right?
Right.
And like, just being able to accept the dimensionality of our experience, and even if we can only see one tiny slice of someone else's, to go, of course they have their whole box of rocks too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I really like that you did there is you used the word and not but.
Mm.
Like you said, I love my kids breathlessly, and the season I am is tough. Like it wasn't, but the season is tough. I
It's
like the and.
it's all and that
Right.
I think is, if I were to like, if the only word I said today was if I could only say one word, and is the word I would use. Like, and I think that's the space we are all trying to get, whether we know it or not, is just the space and permission for it to be and not but. Because I think that's also part of it, is you'll hear, right? You'll hear a parent complain and they'll say, but I love them so
Yep.
much.
Yeah.
And it's not a but. It doesn't have to be a but. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to justify that to anyone. No one would do this job for someone they were not obsessed with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a given. It's too hard. It's too 24/7. It's too intense. Like,
Yes.
And yeah, so that's a huge part of my own journey and my work with people, is how do we get conscious about the stories we're telling and stop acting like anything is just one thing, because that's where the healing and the transformation is possible, is
Yeah.
when we stop comparing how it feels to how we think it should feel, and we start doing the work of accepting, like, okay, this is how it feels, and what's that like? Because the
Yeah.
only opportunity to shift anything is to be in what's true.
Mm-hmm.
And the story that it's either perfect or horrible is very rarely enough space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really good. When you were saying even earlier how this birth plan that you envisioned wasn't necessarily true to you,
Mm-hmm.
it was the story, kind of what you were telling yourself of that it should be, versus like taking that time to really reflect and think like who you are. Um, and yeah, I think that working through this stuff, talking about this stuff before you have a baby, if you can, um, or before you have your next baby, or even hearing this information now and reflecting back, because those stories that we do tell ourselves are so powerful. And I am very guilty of doing things the way that I think people think I should do it
Mm-hmm.
versus how I feel that I really want to.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that I recently had that conversation with my husband because um, I was my 2-year-old's still nursing, and I'm like, I'm gonna wean her by this time, blah blah blah. And then he and I like sat down and talked about it, and I'm like, I don't want to. I'm doing it because I'm tired of people making comments. Like, I'm tired of explaining it. I'm tired of being like, oh, but she only nurses at night, or oh, she only nurses this time, or oh, blah blah blah. It's not all day every day. And I'm like, I would be weaning her for other people instead of
Totally.
us.
Yes.
And that's not fair to either of us.
Uh-uh. And that's, I mean, that's such a beautiful example of exactly this process of going, what's driving me right now, right? When I'm setting this date and proclaiming to my husband and whoever else, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do, what's happening, right? And that it's totally fine, right? As you're saying, you get to decide. You and your daughter get to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say daughter?
Yeah.
Okay. You and your kid get to figure that out. And it's important to notice like who's in the room, right? If we think about like our mind as like a conference room, like if we don't take some time, it's like very easy to just like let that person who made that weird comment at the grocery store make this decision, which when we look at it is like, no, that's not the plan, right? And I think that's a huge part of this. And I think the other piece, maybe the sort of flip side of that, is also that, we have all these jokes in like, we all hear these jokes about getting unsolicited advice when we're pregnant or when we're parenting, right? It's a place where that's like just the air we breathe.
Yeah.
Right.
Constant.
And I think that is a sign, right? People don't comment on other people's like choices and paths when it's a secure, clear place for them. And it's nobody's fault that we feel totally insecure and totally unprepared and totally bereft in certain ways as parents. Some of that is the job. Some of that is just unavoidable. But I also think some of it is that we are all sort of in our own ways committed or contributing to this idea that there's right and wrong ways to do it. And obviously there are things that I think we could bring some morality to, but nursing and how long, how we feed our kids, I don't think it's one of them. And I think that's part of what perpetuates this like positive intention, well-meaning, or maybe not, commentary and debate around other people's families, basically. And it's like, I think all of us, when we drop into our real awareness, right, into our deep or higher selves, kind of know like everyone should do what works for them. And if it's not doing harm, it doesn't have to look like what works for me. But I think we all have so much self-blame and self-judgment in this that we just project it and like slime it all over the place because it's so unprocessed and so unworked through on a collective level. And I think that's part of what's also beautiful about your example is when you talk through it and you go, okay, I'm going to clean this person's slimy projection off of me, right? But I have to notice that it's there first. I have to go, oh, why that date? When I say that date, it makes my stomach hurt, right? Like that's information.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too, like how just going back to like that identity thing, like you in a moment become a parent.
Totally.
And your whole world has changed, but not only your world, your relationship with the people around you. And I've realized about myself that in those first few months of motherhood, I am extremely sensitive to comments that people say about me. Like it just pisses me off, like stupid things, like they'll be like, oh, like, I'll give an example of my mother-in-law and my mom. My mother-in-law, when my first daughter was born, would be like, oh, where are her socks? And I'm like, she's fine. She doesn't need socks. But then like every time we come over, she's like, oh, her toes are cold. And I'm like, shut up about the socks. And then my mom, on the other hand, would be like, why aren't you putting a bow in her hair? Put a bow in her hair. I'm like, we've been in pajamas for a week. I don't know what you're talking about putting a bow in her hair. And I'm not like a super girly girl person. So now all of a sudden my 2-year-old's like super girly girl. And I don't know. I just let her dress herself, but like, I'm like, I never really put bows in her hair, hardly ever. Just, I didn't think to do it, not my thing. And I'd be like, Mom, leave it alone. Like, and it would like, but irk me, like those first couple of months. So I think those roles start to change because I'd start to see like where I had tension in this relationship, where I had tension in this relationship. And then obviously tension with my spouse because he's sleeping and I'm not. So like when the baby's crying and I'm up for the 5th time and he's sleeping like a log and I'm laying there like, you don't even know, like,
Absolutely.
Like, so I mean, it's like that, it's not just your identity, all your relationships completely change like in a moment.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And there's 2 things that came up for me really strongly when you were talking. One is just thinking about like your spouse sleeping, right? And that often I have said to myself and I have said to other people, right? That moment of like rage about your partner sleeping or your partner being out, right? Of the house, doing whatever all those totally valid feelings. Yes. And there's so much information in there. It's like, oh, wow. Okay. So I'm angry, which means I have some need here that's not being met. Right? It's like when him taking a nap feels like he's rubbing something in my face, that means there's work for me and probably for in terms of asking for support from him and other people, because there's an unmet need here for me. Because when I'm good, when my needs are met, I don't begrudge anybody their rest or their social time or whatever. It's about the deficit here, right? And that's so common postpartum. We can't always fix that, right? Like some of it is working with it. Some of it is, doing often the hardest thing we've ever done with the least amount of internal resources, like for instance, rest, as we've ever had for many of us. So I'm not saying that's easy, but I think it's important. And I think it's important to let yourself feel the feeling, right? Because I'll also hear from people like, I feel so bad because I get so angry. And it's like, he's asleep. right? Like, obviously there's ways that we can express anger that are harmful and we shouldn't, but like, you get to have your emotional experience, right? Like, don't get up all night and then be mean to yourself about like whatever thought you had.
Mm-hmm.
But there was another piece of what you said that I'll also want to talk about quickly, which is like the comments, right? And I read something recently, and I'm really upset that I can't tell you where I read it because I don't like to quote things that I can't remember where they came from. But you're making me think about this thing I read recently, which was something like unsolicited advice always lands as criticism.
Mm.
And it really spoke to me because it's one of the things that in my work, I mean, way bigger than postpartum, just as a therapist and as a coach and as a person who is trying to hold a mirror up for people so that they can see more clearly and make choices that feel more true for them. I am so careful because I know that what I think they should do, often I don't even have that thought, but if I do, that's not useful to them.
Right.
They're on their own journey, and the best answers, to the extent that we get any, come from inside us, right? That
Right.
all of our jobs as support people, whether we're dueling, whether we're therapists, coaches, whatever, it's about creating enough space that that person gets to access their own resources, their own knowing. So sorry, I went long on that, but what I want to say about the comments from your mom and your mother-in-law, which like, I'm sure every parent could fill like novels, right? With these like benign, even well-meaning things that landed like,
Right.
oh, right. And not because anyone's bad, but because we're all just out here trying to figure it out.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's really important too, there for all of us is like, what story is that touching in me?
Right. Exactly.
Right. And like, I'm irritated, and that's a real feeling. And if someone said something that didn't land anywhere, that felt completely irrelevant, it wouldn't irritate me.
Right. Yeah, that's so
Right.
true. Mm-hmm.
And like, am I hearing, whether they're saying it or not, am I hearing like, I think you could be doing a better job.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
That was definitely a story I was telling myself. Like, where are her
Right.
socks? You suck.
Right. Or it comes out in this like angry way, which totally makes sense. And sometimes that means it's a boundary, right? And that can be really hard work, especially with people we love. And it sounds like,
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, being like, oh, something's ruffling my feathers because actually like that decision doesn't belong to you. Right. About the socks or the bow or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of assumption that it does, or that it should be your way, feels wrong in a way, even though very rarely is anyone like marching in here like, let me tell you how I'm going to do it. Like,
right.
just, it comes out in these ways that it's not malicious on anyone's part,
right?
But that we get to become more aware maybe and learn more about ourselves through our responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I realized it with my second one too, because I'm like, oh, I'm back in this place where everything everyone says to me is really irritating because I was internalizing it of like, and I'm like, just leave me alone. I know what I'm doing.
Totally.
If I want advice, I'll ask.
And also, I think you're talking about just the physiological, right? The capacity, right? The same way, like when we're tired, when we're sleep deprived, right? The fuse is just short.
Right.
Like we are more reactive when we are less rested. That's like nervous system 101. There's no doubt about it, right? In the same way that like sometimes people will tell couples like, don't go to bed mad. And I'm like, go to bed. Like having a fight when you are at your most tired is not a good idea, right? Like go to bed. And then if tomorrow you're still mad, let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a long version of that postpartum for a lot of us, where if we were sleeping 9 hours, or if we didn't have the like living, blaring alarm clock of a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we would have things that we would have the capacity to let things roll off of us.
Mm-hmm.
And when we don't, we just don't.
Right. Or even the capacity to have the conversation of setting
That's
that
also
boundary.
so hard, right? Because it's like so much of the,
it's like, I just can't even
so much of the conventional wisdom postpartum is like, well, just tell them. And it's like, I have like 3 words that I know in this point. Like, it's just very hard. It's a tough ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like you touched on so many different things, and I love all of it. Cause honestly, like I feel like you just talk about after you become a mom or a parent, or, you know, like leading up to it, preparing for pregnancy, but just that real mental aspect is so big, and
Mhm.
having the conversations around that identity shift and even how you're coping. I think it's so important to figure some tools out
Absolutely.
beforehand, um, because things come up in motherhood. I feel like your
Absolutely.
kids reflect everything that you need to work on in yourself back to
Oh
you.
man, it's so rough.
Yeah, I'm like, "Oh, wow. I have some real deep-rooted issues here that I need to work
Absolutely.
through."
And yeah, and we all do, right? Like that's the thing is like that's I think the really beautiful part is that we get to bring, I love Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, and one of the elements she talks about is common humanity, right? Which is reminding ourselves like, oh yeah, we all get triggered. We all have stuff that's unfinished, right? And not and just being like accepting that so we can do the work of moving forward or learning something or trying something new. So many of us get stuck in the like judging ourselves about it. Well, that's just the way I am, you know? There's no forward movement there. And it's like as you're saying, our kids, like their reflections to us are so intense, and it's also like it's such a beautiful opportunity. Like those triggers, those moments are a doorway to a deeper connection with ourselves and with them.
Mhm.
And it's really hard, right? Like you're making me think of too in couples therapy, which is not my thing, but I did like I you know have studied it to some extent, but the you're making me think about imago couples therapy, which is basically the sort of main premise is that we choose partners in a sort of semi-conscious way because there are patterns that are familiar enough in our sort of original attachment relationships. And this is not always true, but the theory
Mhm.
goes that like we're going to find partners who in some ways maybe trigger or touch on the hardest or most wounded parts of ourselves because we are looking for an opportunity to kind of reenact and heal the
Mhm.
stuff that we have, that formed us that is as yet unhealed, right? And I think our kids do that too, right? And they're not doing anything except growing and living, and they're not thinking
Right.
about us, right? It's not like some kind of, and it's not their job, right? To somehow bring up these things for us so we can work on them. But the reality of the relationship is they do. And that too is mixed, right? That we can love our kids and like them and be delighted by them. And we can also sometimes be like, man, I wish this mirror was not so constant, so accurate, so like technicolor,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm. Right, yeah. I mean, you hear the phrase, "When it rains, it pours," and sometimes it does feel like that
oh
in
yeah,
parenting, where it's like, "Wow, it's been really rough a lot lately," and you go through those
totally.
seasons where it's like,
Yes,
"Wow, so much is happening."
it is so much. Yeah.
Mhm. And then when you're doing it, yeah, with not much sleep or whatever, I mean, it's hard when that tank isn't full, but having those tools and even just knowing that when you are feeling angry, when you're feeling triggered, upset, that that's something coming up for you and that it's not
Mhm.
the other person.
Totally.
Obviously it's not your 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old kid.
No.
Um, and even the people offering unsolicited advice. Um, but then it does fall on us to, if there are people like that are in our lives continually, to set boundaries and to have conversations.
Absolutely.
But it is so hard. That's where I really, really struggle.
It is so hard. And it reminds me of what you were saying earlier about like people pleasing and perfectionism and like wanting to do what you think other people want you to do. And like how do you prioritize what you actually want to do if it's not the same, and like managing all of that.
Mhm.
And that's part of all of this for all of us, right? Like I think, at least for me, certainly having both of my daughters, right? Like the way that I have had to grow my capacity for hard conversations, and not in not with clients because that's a different thing, but with close personal family people on behalf of what I want for my kids. And
Mhm.
not that anyone's doing anything wrong, but that sometimes I have to say like we're not going to talk about other people's bodies.
Right.
Like I don't want we're not doing that.
Mhm.
And I feel really clear that I don't want that.
Mhm.
uh and because it's them, there's a courage in me that is maybe I don't always have on behalf of myself.
Yeah.
But the reminder that like I think it's Brene Brown who says that like kind is clear, or clear is kind, unclear is unkind.
Hmm.
And I, as a recovering people pleaser myself, have to come back over and over to like, actually the way I care for people and the way I care for our relationship is to be as authentic as I can in it, rather than pulling away and like, it's all good, but actually I'm holding a lot that's damaging the relationship on a foundational level. They just don't
Right.
know about it.
Right. But I also feel like you do kind of almost know about it. Like that
Oh,
I
they
feel
don't
like
know
you,
what it is, but you feel it on the other end of
right.
the
There is
relationship for
usually
sure.
some sort of like passive aggressive
Mhm.
something you can tell that you can't fully say what you
Totally.
want type of thing.
Yes. I think that's true. I think we are kidding ourselves when we think that we can perform, certainly in long-term relationships, and that doesn't have an impact that is felt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then when you were saying mirror, there's another thing. I had a really vivid memory that very recent come to mind where it was like the morning hustle. I was like juggling, getting both my kids ready, like got to get them out the door, got to, the school bell and all the things and the lunches and whatever. And my older daughter had made something. I can't even remember what it was, but she held it up to be like, Mom, look. And I said something like, beautiful. And my like toddler's over here. And she goes, you don't mean that. And I was like, I just like took a breath. And I was like, I like really looked at her and was like, you know what? You're right. It's not that I don't think it's beautiful. I didn't even look at it. My mind is on like, get our shoes on and get out of here and relate. And but she said like, I know that voice, like you're not listening, you're not here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's what I think is so beautiful and like about the mirror is that they, as you're saying, they feel the things even that we don't say, even that we think they don't know, right? And that they don't necessarily have the like, in a beautiful way, they don't necessarily have the polite socialization to then act like they don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
um and I think that's one of the things that is so beautiful and that hopefully we get to cultivate as adults too, is to like start just admitting what we see and what we know, and trusting that that will unfold in a way that maybe serves us better than like perfecting and pretending and all the rest of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's amazing that you were able to just be honest with her though, too, and have that conversation. Cause I feel like it's so easy to, again, dismiss or brush off or go with the hustle and be like, yeah, of course it's beautiful,
Right. Well, and
and
so
not take
as you're
that
saying,
moment.
it's so easy to double down and be like, I do think it's beautiful. It's like whether you think it's beautiful or not is not the point. She's
Right.
saying, I feel you not here with me.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want to always say to her is, okay, my bad. Let me come back.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's not any school bell that's more important than that.
Right.
And we can't always do it. Right. And that then we have to give ourselves the grace and the permission to like do some repair work and be like, hey, this morning, I don't know if you felt it, but I really wasn't listening. And I was rushing. And now I want to just check back in with you. Like, how are you? And what were you trying to say? And, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Goes
but I
back to
think,
that messy, right?
yeah, it's messy.
It's
Right. And,
messy.
and letting them see that they already do. Our kids aren't like, our kids are not over here like, my perfect mom. They think we're wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
right? Most of the time. And that's probably because we are. And it's okay to admit that we don't always know, or that we didn't always get it right, or that we're trying and it's hard, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes space for them to feel all their feelings too.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that you shared that because I feel like that's a story that will come to mind, for people listening and for myself, like in those moments where that pops up. Because all of us are busy. All of us have chaotic lives, right?
Totally.
All of it's messy. Like being human is messy and it's
Yes.
okay. Like it's okay to be like, it's messy and it's hard and it's beautiful and it's, everything all
Right.
at once. And that's okay.
Yeah. It better be okay because it's true.
Right.
There's no other
It's a
way. I mean,
fact.
it
So.
is okay, but also it is like, that's what we got.
Mm-hmm.
And, and yeah, and that's kind of the mission that I'm on across the board, professionally, personally, with all the things. But right now I'm really focused on like pregnancy, birth, what it means to bring more permission, messiness, space, to that season for people, because I think it's incredibly necessary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is. It is. I want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. I feel like there was so many yes, because
Thank you.
like I said, I just really haven't had, I feel like you see people talking about the after they become parents and like, mom life, whatever,
Yeah.
hashtag.
Yeah.
And it's, and there are some like amazing accounts or whatever on Instagram, like they do share the raw, the vulnerable, whatever, um, but there's just like it, there's not like space for it all, right? And having
Yeah.
this conversation of the preparing beforehand and working with somebody like you before you even decide to have kids, giving yourself those tools and resources, and having those conversations and kind of setting yourself up for success afterwards. It's like, I'm a huge fan of preventative care.
Totally.
And it's the same for your mental health too.
Absolutely. And I think it's the same for every birth process, right? Like even folks who it's not their first birth or their first kid, it's their first this birth and their first this kid, right? And I think giving ourselves the space that like we don't have to know all of it, and we're not going to.
Right. Absolutely. So for people listening, where can they learn more about you? Where can they find you, connect with you, and all of that goodness?
Absolutely. So the best place to find me is on my website, which is Amelia Kriss. So it's Amelia with an A, and Kriss is KRISS.com. I'm sure it will be in the show notes. So that's where I am, and that's where you can find me and all the things. Also on my site, I have a newsletter for pregnant folks, which is called Soft Cheese. And it's about like celebrating like all the absurdity and all the sacredness of that whole time. Again, the and of it. And it's really, I call it a newsletter, but it's really just like love letters. Like it's a weekly email. And I really just like, my heart is really in like creating a companion for pregnant folks, even if they never work with me, right? That has like resources, exercises, right? Some of what we're talking about in terms of like, know thyself and comfort measures that could work for you, or experiences you've had that may be relevant. Like it's just, I just want people to have a space to reflect on themselves in that way. So that's what that's about. So
Awesome.
yeah,
I love the name Soft Cheese. It just made me want some.
I hear you. That was the
Like,
thing that
that
when I was
sounds good.
pregnant, that was like unclear, iffy, not allowed, that I really wanted.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can offer that. I can offer some softness and some cheesiness. Like
Yeah.
I can be accountable to that.
Yeah,
So
for
yeah,
sure. Awesome. Well, Amelia, thank you so much for coming on and for having this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I know that the listeners are going to get so much out of it because it's there. It was creating space, for this season, and to feel everything and to just validate that two opposing truths can be true, right?
absolutely. Like if this feels like a lot, if this feels messy, that's totally normal.
Yeah,
It doesn't
it's
mean anything
okay.
about you.
Right. Everybody's messy. It's
Yeah.
normal again. Yeah. So, yeah, I just want to thank you again so much for your time and energy and for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Let me